There is a number that the United States tourism industry has been staring at for months now, and it doesn't get easier to look at the closer the World Cup gets. In 2024, Canadian visitors made 20.4 million trips to the United States, spending approximately $20.5 billion dollars and supporting around 140,000 American jobs. Canadians were, by a significant margin, the single largest source of foreign tourists to the United States, the most important international visitors the country had, the bedrock of American inbound tourism. In 2025, Canadian travel to the United States fell by close to 30%. 30% in a single year from the country's most important source of international visitors. Not a rounding error, not a statistical anomaly, a collapse in the most foundational pillar of American tourism, happening in the 12 months immediately before the United States co-hosts the largest sporting events in history. And Canada's World Cup bookings are up 173%. If you are trying to understand what is really happening with the 2026 FIFA World Cup, not the version being described in FIFA press releases, not the one framed around projected revenues and tournament records, those two numbers placed side by side tell you almost everything. The world was expected to flood into North America this summer. It is flooding into parts of North America, just not always the parts that were expecting it most. This is the full story of that divergence, how Canada went from being America's most loyal tourist partner to the World Cup's most surprising tourism success story. What drove the shift? What it means for the atmosphere inside the stadiums, and why the contrast between what's happening in Vancouver and Toronto versus what's happening in Dallas and Philadelphia may turn out to be one of the defining stories of the entire 2026 tournament. Let's start with the American side of the picture, because understanding what went wrong there is essential to understanding why Canada and Mexico's position looks so different. International tourism to the United States declined by approximately 5.4% in 2025, even as global tourism overall continued to grow during the same period. That's the key detail. The world didn't stop traveling in 2025. It kept traveling enthusiastically to Europe, to Asia, to Latin America. Global tourism was healthy. American inbound tourism was shrinking. In a growing market, the United States lost market share. The reasons are documented and consistent across multiple sources. A new visa integrity fee of $250 added cost to the application process. Plans for social media screening of visa applicants made the prospect of applying feel intrusive and unpredictable to potential visitors. Stricter border controls created longer processing times and less certainty about outcomes. And for Canadians specifically, the people who generated $20.5 billion in spending in a single year, the combination of border crossing concerns, currency pressure, and a shifting sense of whether they felt welcome when they arrived produced the 30% drop that has no recent parallel in cross-border tourism history. Visit Seattle, one of the official tourism bodies for a World Cup host city, reported that the number of international World Cup visitors expected in their city has fallen by 17%. The primary driver, in their own assessment, is the decline in Canadian tourists. Canadian flight bookings to the United States plunged to between 71 and 76% in March 2025 compared to the previous year. Cross-border car crossings dropped 23%. The retail and tourism revenue loss from Canadian visitors alone is estimated at approximately $3 billion Canadian dollars. The U.S. tourism sector was banking on the World Cup to reverse this trend, to be the event so large, so compelling, so impossible to miss that the decline of 2025 would be arrested and corrected. And in some respects, domestic American demand, Americans traveling to World Cup cities within their own country, has been a genuine positive. Local travel intentions to U.S. host cities for the tournament period have risen by an average of nearly 4 percentage points year on year. There is genuine enthusiasm among American football fans for a home World Cup, and that enthusiasm is real and worth acknowledging. But the international demand that was projected, the flood of European, South American, African, and Asian visitors that was supposed to justify the hotel pricing, the resale ticket market, and FIFA's $30 billion economic impact estimate, has not arrived in the numbers expected. And the gap between projected international arrivals and actual booking pace is the story underneath every other story about this tournament. Now, here is where the Canadian picture becomes genuinely remarkable, because while American cities were watching international booking pace decline and hotel operators were describing the World Cup as a non-event, Canada was doing something almost entirely different. Canadian host city hotel reservations are up 173% compared to the same period last year. The province of British Columbia expects approximately 350,000 visitors to travel to Vancouver specifically for World Cup activities. Deloitte's analysis for Metro Vancouver estimates more than 1 million visitor nights linked to the tournament across the wider region. When FIFA canceled its hotel room blocks in Vancouver, the same action that caused 40% price drops in American cities, BC's hotel market absorbed the surplus without significant disruption. The underlying demand was strong enough that 15,000 additional room nights entering the market didn't collapse the pricing structure. It just gave fans more options at strong rates.
That is a fundamentally different market. And the reasons behind it are worth going through carefully because they explain not just why Canada is working, but why the contrast with the United States is so stark. The first reason is access. Canada's entry process for international visitors is straightforward. The electronic travel authorization, completed online, $7 Canadian, available to citizens of visa-exempt countries, covers most of the international fans who want to attend World Cup matches in Vancouver or Toronto. Canada has not introduced financial bond requirements. Canada has not introduced social media screening. Canada has not generated advisories from Amnesty International or over 100 civil society organizations about the safety of visiting. The Canadian Human Rights Commission has not been issuing warnings to international football fans about what might happen when they arrive. For fans from dozens of countries comparing their options, for the Brazilian supporter trying to decide whether to route through Toronto or directly into Miami, for the European fan weighing Vancouver against Los Angeles, for the supporter from West Africa whose visa application for the United States involves layers of documentation that Canada simply doesn't require, Canada wins on accessibility without even trying very hard. The second reason is what Canada cities actually are. And this is a football story as much as a tourism story, because what makes Vancouver and Toronto exceptional World Cup venues isn't primarily their infrastructure, it's their populations. Toronto is one of the most culturally diverse cities on Earth. More than 50% of its residents were born outside Canada. When Canada plays Bosnia and Herzegovina at BMO Field on June the 12th, the first men's World Cup match ever staged on Canadian soil, the streets around that stadium will contain supporters from virtually every nation participating in the tournament. Not because they flew from their home country specifically for the match, because they already live in Toronto. The Bosnian diaspora community in the Greater Toronto area is substantial and passionate. The world is already there. The World Cup is arriving into a city that has been a World Cup in miniature for 30 years. And then there is the specific dynamic of Canada's own national team, which adds an emotional layer to this tournament's chapter that the booking numbers alone don't capture. Canada qualified for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, their first appearance since 1986, and arrived with a squad built around genuine talent. Alphonso Davies, the Bayern Munich left-back, is one of the most exciting players in European football. Jonathan David has been one of the most consistent goal scorers in Ligue 1 for 3 consecutive seasons. The 2022 campaign introduced the world to a Canadian football culture that had been quietly building for a decade, and the world responded warmly. In 2026, Canada doesn't just participate in the World Cup, Canada hosts it
for the first time. The players who took the country to Qatar will now play in front of their own people, in their own cities, at the tournament they have spent their entire careers working toward. That is an emotional context that no amount of commercial planning produces. It either exists or it doesn't. In Canada, in the summer of 2026, it exists at a level that is palpable in the booking data, in the fan community activity, in the preparation that cities across the country have been making for years. Mexico's story is different again. Older, louder, built on 6 decades of World Cup passion rather than a generation's first experience. And the tourism numbers from Mexico are, if anything, even more striking than Canada's. Mexico projects a 30% surge in tourist arrivals during the tournament period. Guadalajara alone anticipates $500 million in local revenue from the World Cup. Mexico City hotel rates for the competition period are up 48.9% year-on-year, the sharpest accommodation price rise of any host city in the entire tournament. While American cities watch hotel rates fall after FIFA's room block cancellations, Mexico City's market is moving in the opposite direction because demand is genuinely outpacing supply. The Azteca's opening match on June 11th, Mexico versus South Africa, has been sold out for months. The secondary market for Azteca tickets is running in the opposite direction from American venues. While resale prices for 90% of American matches are falling, demand for Azteca matches is being sustained by a combination of domestic Mexican passion, Latin American fans choosing Mexico City as their regional World Cup base, and international visitors specifically seeking the atmospheric intensity that only the Estadio Azteca can provide. Here's where things get interesting in a way that reveals something important about the tournament's overall shape. The three-nation format was designed as a unified hosting arrangement. The United bid, presented to FIFA in 2018, was built on the premise that the United States, Canada, and Mexico would function as a single coherent tournament. The infrastructure of one country, the football culture of another, the history of the third, all contributing to a single shared experience. What is actually emerging in the tourism data and booking patterns of May 2026 looks more like 3 separate tournaments happening simultaneously under one brand. Mexico is delivering everything its World Cup history promised: full stadiums, extraordinary atmosphere, a host city celebrating the return of the greatest show in football after 40 years away. Canada is delivering something it has never delivered before, a first-ever World Cup host nation experience in cities that contain the world's football diversity in their own populations. And America, where 75% of the matches will be played, is grappling with a tourism landscape that is more complicated than anyone in 2018 fully anticipated. The gap between those 3 experiences is significant, and it has consequences for the football itself. Not just for hotel revenues and economic impact projections, but for the atmosphere inside the stadiums, the noise that the television broadcast picks up, the sense of whether these matches feel like a World Cup or like something that resembles one. Think about what a World Cup ground sounds like when it's working. The energy building before kickoff, the sections of the stadium that know every chant and start them at precisely the right moment, the collective sharp intake of breath when a chant goes close, the noise that erupts from not just a single section, but from every part of the ground simultaneously when a goal goes in. That experience, the one that separates watching a World Cup live from watching it on television, requires the presence of passionate supporters who understand what they're watching and feel it with total intensity. Canada is going to produce that in Toronto and Vancouver. The cultural diversity of those cities, combined with Canada's own national team playing its first home World Cup, virtually guarantees it. The noise at BMO Field when Davies makes a run down the left in front of a sold-out crowd that contains every football culture on earth, that is going to be extraordinary. Mexico is going to produce it in ways that only Mexico can. The Azteca on June 11th will be one of the loudest sporting environments in the world. 87,000 people in a stadium that has been producing this kind of noise since 1966 for a match that starts the biggest World Cup in history in a country that has been waiting 40 years for the tournament to come back. No description adequately prepares you. Pelé tried and settled for saying you need to be inside it to understand. What happens in the American venues, in the mid-table group stage matches in Kansas City, in the fixtures between smaller nations in Atlanta, in the sections of SoFi Stadium that were still unsold 3 weeks from kickoff, is a more open question. The domestic enthusiasm is real. American football fans who have waited 32 years for a home World Cup are genuinely excited and will be present. The matches involving major nations, England and Dallas, Germany and Houston, Brazil and San Francisco, will generate the international following that those teams always carry. But the full, global, multicultural atmosphere that a World Cup is supposed to generate, every corner of the world represented in the stands, every language being spoken, the sense that football really has united the world in one place, that will be present in Toronto and Vancouver and Mexico City in a way that may not be replicated consistently across all 11 American host cities. And the industry data confirms this pattern even before a ball has been kicked. The research firm Data Appeal, alongside Mabrian and Predict HQ, published analysis showing that while international travel intent is rising across all three host nations, the growth rates vary significantly by region. International tourism data suggests that Canada, alongside Mexico, is attracting particularly strong interest compared with some U.S. host cities. The gap between nations is widening, not narrowing, as the tournament approaches. What does all of this mean for FIFA? Because the organization that promised a $30 billion economic windfall across all three host nations is now watching the windfall distribute very unevenly, and the country hosting 75% of the matches is the one underperforming. For football specifically, the lesson of the Canada and Mexico contrast is one that FIFA would benefit from studying honestly. The tournaments that produced the most memorable atmospheres in recent history, France 1998, South Africa 2010, Brazil 2014, did so because they were staged in countries where football was already the center of the culture, where the fans who filled the stadiums didn't need to be persuaded to go, where the passion was pre-existing and the World Cup simply gave it a stage. Canada and Mexico have that quality this summer, and they're different ways. Canada because it's new, the specific intensity of doing something for the first time, of a football nation finding its moment on the biggest stage. Mexico because it's ancient, the weight of 60 years of World Cup memory in the walls of the Azteca, the passion that has never needed a tournament to justify itself. The 2026 World Cup will be remembered for the football on the pitch. It'll be remembered for whoever lifts the trophy at MetLife on the 19th of July. But it will also be remembered for this contrast, for the data that showed Canada's bookings at 173% and Seattle's international arrivals down 17% in the same tournament, for the 30% drop in Canadian visitors to the United States appearing in the same year that Canada's World Cup venues were selling out. Tourism follows welcome. Fans go where they feel wanted. And in the summer of 2026, the data is showing us, in the clearest possible terms, which parts of this tournament made the world feel wanted and which parts did not. Would you rather watch a match at the Azteca, at BC Place in Vancouver, or at one of the American NFL stadiums? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. And tell me whether you think the atmosphere gap between the three host nations will be visible on television when the tournament begins. If this kind of honest football journalism is what you come here for, no noise, just a real story told clearly, a like and a subscribe means a great deal. See you in the next one. 24 days. The football is coming, and it's going to sound very different depending on which city you're in when it arrives.